A hall the size of a cathedral, alive, walls that breathe, floors that ripple beneath every step, a ceiling that doesn't end, it becomes light. Three-star systems sent their most powerful people to this room, hundreds of delegates, standing in perfect silence, every movement rehearsed, every breath measured. At the center, a child, small, still, holding herself together the way glass holds before it shatters, her fingers white at her sides, her eyes locked forward, seeing nothing. No one moves toward her, no one looks, except one man, a nobody, a technician, standing at the edge of the room with a device in his hand and no authority to do anything but watch. He was told not to speak, not to move, not to interfere. He watches the child begin to break, and then he takes a step, one step, into everything. Part 1. The Man at the Edge. The transport smelled like recycled air and quiet regret. Harlan sat in the third row, alone, which was fine. He preferred alone. Alone didn't ask questions. Alone didn't tilt its head and say things like, "How are you holding up?" or "Have you thought about talking to someone?" Alone just sat there, like him. He had the mission brief open on his tablet, fourth time reading it, not because it was complicated, because it was the opposite. So simple it made him nervous. The document was 3 pages long, which in diplomatic terms meant the job was either incredibly easy or catastrophically dangerous. No in between. He'd learned that the hard way. Twice, page 1, assignment overview. Technical translator support for the Valorian right of emergence. Non-participatory role. Minimal interaction required. Page 2, behavioral guidelines. This was the long one, 27 bullet points. All of them essentially saying the same thing in 27 slightly different ways. Don't speak unless spoken to. Don't move unless necessary. Don't make eye contact longer than 3 seconds. Don't turn your head quickly. Don't touch anything. Don't breathe in a way that seems aggressive. That last one wasn't actually written down, but it was implied. Harlan could feel it between the lines. The general energy of the document was less welcome to Valoria and more please try not to exist too loudly. Page 3. Emergency protocols. One sentence. In the event of a diplomatic incident, remain stationary and await extraction. Harlan stared at that sentence for a long time. Remain stationary. Await extraction. That was the plan. That was always the plan. Stand still. Wait. Let someone else handle it. He was very good at that plan. He closed the tablet. Outside the viewport, stars drifted by. Not dramatically, not poetically, just there. The way stars always were. Indifferent. Unconcerned with the small, anxious man hurtling through space toward a planet he'd never visited. For a ceremony he didn't understand, in a language he could barely pronounce. His earpiece crackled. Harlan, Soren's voice, his supervisor, direct, clipped. The kind of voice that had never once in its life said, "Let's see how it goes." "Yeah, you read the brief 4 times. Good, read it again." Harlan almost smiled. Almost. "So, it's 3 pages. I could recite it backward." "Then recite it backward." "I don't care, just don't do anything stupid." "Define stupid." A pause, the kind of pause that carried weight. The kind that said, "I know you, and that's why I'm worried." "Harlan, this is a rite of emergence. Do you understand what that means? Big ceremony, important people, glowing architecture, don't sneeze." It means every delegate from 3-star systems will be in that room. Every ambassador. Every political figure with enough influence to start or end a war. And you, a technical translator, holding a tablet. I'm very good at holding tablets. You're very good at making decisions that seem reasonable to you and insane to everyone else. That one landed, because it was true. Harlan leaned back, stared at the ceiling. The transport hummed around him. Steady, mechanical, predictable. everything he was supposed to be for the next 12 hours. It's my last job, he said quietly. I know. Silence, then Soren, softer now. I know it's your last one. That's why I'm asking. Just get through it. Come home. You're done after this. Home. The words sat in his chest like a stone he'd swallowed years ago and never managed to cough up. Home was an apartment on Earth with too many empty rooms. Home was a hallway where a small pair of shoes still sat by the door because he couldn't move them. Because moving them meant admitting they'd never be worn again. Home was the place he'd been running from for 5 years. Yeah, Harlan said. Home. He ended the call before Soren could hear anything else. The transport hummed on, steady, indifferent. Harlan pulled up the assignment file one more time. Not to read it, just to look at the date. His contract termination was listed at the bottom in small gray text. 14 hours after the ceremony concluded. That was it. After that, nothing. No more assignments. No more briefings. No more 27 bullet point documents telling him how to exist in a room. Just Earth. Just the apartment. Just him. He'd been planning this for months. The slow, careful construction of an exit. No fanfare, no farewell tour. Just a clean break from the only thing that had kept him moving for 3 years. He would go home. He would sit in the apartment. He would figure out what people did when they weren't running anymore. He had no idea what that looked like, but it was the plan. And Harlan was a man who trusted plans, even bad ones, especially bad ones, because bad plans were still plans. And plans meant you didn't have to feel anything. You just had to follow instructions. He closed the tablet, again, stared at the ceiling, again, and waited for the transport to take him somewhere he didn't want to go. For the last time. The transport docked 40 minutes later. Harlan stepped onto Valorian ground and immediately regretted not reading page 2 a fifth time. Because nobody had mentioned that the air here would feel like this. It wasn't just air, it was present, like it had opinions, like it was paying attention to him specifically and forming judgments about his posture. The gravity was close to Earth standard. Close, not exact, just different enough that every step felt like his body was being gently corrected, like the ground was saying, almost try again. He followed the escort team through a series of corridors that didn't behave the way corridors should. The walls curved when they should have been straight. The light came from everywhere and nowhere. And the floor. The floor was not entirely solid. It responded to his weight, adjusted, shifted. Harlan looked down at it. Please don't be alive, he muttered. It pulsed faintly beneath his boot. Great. He kept walking. The escort stopped at a set of massive doors, or what he assumed were doors. They didn't have handles, or seams, or any indication that they were meant to open. They simply existed. Tall, luminous, slightly intimidating. One of the escorts turned to him. The emergence hall, they said, calm, neutral, as if announcing a conference room and not a living cathedral that could apparently read emotions. Wonderful, Harlan said. Can it hear me? The escort blinked. The hall, Harlan clarified. Can it hear what I'm saying right now? A pause, then. The bioresponsive lattice interprets emotional frequencies, not specific language. So it can't hear me, but it can feel me. That is, an adequate summary. Harlan nodded slowly. So if I'm standing in there and I'm slightly terrified, the whole building knows. Another pause. Longer. Yes. Okay, Harlan said. Good talk. The doors opened. Not mechanically. Not with a sound. They simply weren't there anymore. One moment solid. The next, gone. Replaced by an expanse so vast, Harlan's sense of spatial logic quietly filed a complaint and resigned. The emergence hall. He'd read about it, studied the schematics, seen the holographic models. None of that mattered now, because the real thing was not something you understood with information. It was something you experienced with your entire nervous system. The ceiling didn't exist, not in any way Harlan could process. It stretched upward and then became something else. light, color, frequency, a shifting canopy of living luminescence that responded to the movement below. The walls pulsed, gently, rhythmically, like breathing, like the building itself had lungs and a heartbeat and a very strong opinion about everyone inside it. The floor was a responsive surface, semi-translucent. Every step sent a faint ripple outward, like walking on the surface of a calm lake. Columns rose throughout the space, not built, grown, semi-organic structures that glowed with soft violet light, each one slightly different, each one pulsing at its own rhythm. And the sound, not music, not quite, a harmonic resonance that lived in the walls, in the air, in the spaces between spaces. It wasn't something you heard, it was something you felt in the back of your skull, in the base of your spine. Harlan stood just inside the entrance and did not move. "Okay," he whispered. "Don't panic. You're inside a building that's alive, that can feel your emotions, that is currently aware of how anxious you are. That's fine, completely fine." He looked down at his tablet, still synced, still calibrated, still doing absolutely nothing interesting. Perfect. He moved to his assigned position, a spot near one of the living columns, close enough to be useful if the translation systems needed manual adjustment, far enough from everything else to be invisible. The column beside him pulsed with soft violet light, like a heartbeat trapped in crystal. He reached out, almost, then stopped, because touching things in alien buildings without permission felt like the kind of decision that ended up in incident reports. He stood there instead, let the rhythm of the column wash over him. It was almost peaceful, almost meditative. If you ignored the fact that the building was alive and probably forming opinions about your stress levels. Harlan checked his tablet, calibrated, synced, running perfectly. Absolutely nothing for him to do. Perfect. Nothing was his specialty. Invisible. That was the goal. Be furniture. Be wallpaper. Be the guy no one remembers was even there. Blend into the background so completely that when the ceremony was over, people would look at his spot and think, was someone standing there? I don't think so. Must have been a shadow. He was excellent at being a shadow. He'd been practicing for 5 years. Ever since the apartment got too quiet and Earth got too small and the distance between himself and everything he used to care about grew so wide that he could stand at one edge and not see the other. Shadows didn't get hurt. Shadows didn't lose things. Shadows just stood near walls and existed, quietly, unremarkably. He could do that. He'd been doing that for 5 years. The hall filled slowly. Delegates arrived in the measured intervals, each entrance precisely timed, each movement choreographed with the kind of mathematical precision that made Harlan's head hurt. Valorians moved differently than humans. Not better, not worse, just differently. Their bodies were slightly taller, leaner. Their skin carried a faint iridescence that shifted with light, and their ears, long, elegantly arched, adorned with thin metallic rings that caught the ambient glow. Those rings weren't jewelry. Harlan had been briefed on that. The rings were interfaces, sensors, communication arrays, possibly weapons. With Valorians, it was usually all three at once, which was either elegant engineering or deeply concerning. He hadn't decided which. He watched the delegates take their positions, each one a study in control, composure, stillness, like a room full of chess pieces arranged with absolute intention. Harlan felt very much like a chess piece that had wandered in from a completely different game. Checkers, maybe Jenga, something far less dignified. He adjusted his tablet, pretended to check calibration, pretended to be busy, pretended to be the kind of person who belonged in a room like this. And then, she entered. I didn't see Queen Seraphine arrive. He felt it. The entire hall shifted, not physically, emotionally, energetically. Like gravity had politely increased by a fraction, and everyone's spine had responded accordingly. She stood at the far end of the chamber, and even from this distance, she drew the eye in a way that felt less like attention and more like physics. Her posture was composed without effort, her presence quiet yet impossible to ignore. The living structures reflected along the contours of her attire. an intricate fusion of organic fibers and embedded technology that seemed to shift with her breathing. Her ears, long, adorned with rings more elaborate than any other delegate's. They angled slightly outward, catching frequencies Harlan couldn't hear, processing information Harlan couldn't imagine. She was not looking at him. She was not looking at anyone specifically, and yet the room felt like it was being seen. Harlan exhaled carefully. "Right," he whispered. "Do not stare at the queen. That is a very bad career decision." So naturally, he stared slightly to the left of the queen, and that's when he saw the child. Princess Leora stood beside her mother. Small, very small, especially against the scale of everything around her. The hall, the delegates, the ceremony, the expectations. Her posture mirrored the queen's, in structure, but not in certainty. There was a tension in the way she held herself, a stiffness that didn't belong to ceremony. It belonged to effort, to the kind of concentration required when every molecule of your body wants to be somewhere else, but your mind is forcing you to stay. Harlan recognized it, instantly, not because he was observant, not because he was trained, because he had lived inside that exact posture for months after his daughter died, standing at gatherings where people expected him to be composed, holding himself rigid because if he relaxed even slightly, the whole thing would come apart. The girl's hands were at her sides, fingers too still, too controlled, the kind of stillness that takes more energy than movement. Her gaze was forward, fixed, unfocused, like she was staring at a point in space that didn't exist, a point where she could pretend none of this was happening. Harlan's chest tightened because he knew that look. He knew it from mirrors, from the reflection in transport windows late at night when he thought no one was watching, from the face of a man who had learned to hold everything inside so precisely that no one would ever think to ask if he was okay. Because he looked fine. He always looked fine. Nessa had been 6 years old, brown eyes, a gap in her front teeth that she was proud of, tiny hands that could grip his finger with surprising strength, a laugh that sounded like someone had bottled sunlight and poured it out. She had been on the transport to the colony station. Routine transfer. Nothing dangerous, nothing unusual, except the coupling failed at the junction point, and the secondary hull breached. And 23 people didn't come home. 23, including one very small girl with brown eyes who had called for her father. And her father had been 4 systems away, calibrating a translation matrix for a diplomatic summit he couldn't even remember the name of now. He hadn't been there. That was the thing that lived inside him like a second heartbeat. Not that she died. People died. The universe was not kind. He understood that. But that she died. And he wasn't there. Wasn't there to hold her hand. Wasn't there to tell her it would be okay. Wasn't there to be the face she saw last, instead of strangers, instead of metal and cold, and the sound of alarms that nobody could silence. 5 years. The first 2 he spent on Earth, barely functioning, taking local assignments, short ones. The kind that let him come back to the apartment every night and sit in Nessa's room and stare at walls that still smelled faintly of the crayon drawings she'd taped everywhere. Then the walls stopped smelling like anything, and the apartment stopped feeling like a place he'd shared with someone. And Earth itself started feeling like a museum dedicated to a life that wasn't his anymore. So he applied for off-world work. Technical translation. The kind of job that put him in rooms where nothing was expected of him, where he could stand in the background, hold a tablet, not get involved. 3 years of that. 3 years of distant planets, brief assignments, no connections, no attachments, no risk. And now, this, the last one. One more ceremony, one more room where he didn't belong, and then home, back to the apartment, back to the shoes by the door, back to nothing. He looked at Leora, and Lyora, without knowing it, looked exactly like every photograph of himself he couldn't stand to see. "Yeah," he murmured, barely audible, eyes dropping to the tablet. "I know that look." I didn't move, not yet. The ceremony began. A single tone resonated through the hall, low, deep, the kind of sound you felt in your bones before your ears registered it. The living architecture responded, walls brightening, floor stabilizing into a firmer surface, the columns pulsing in synchronized rhythm. Beautiful. That was the only word for it. Delegates began to speak, their voices modulated, precise, carried through the ambient translation system so smoothly that Harlan's tablet barely registered any processing lag. The technology here was generations beyond anything Earth had developed. Light patterns shifted across the walls with each phase of the ritual. Visual language, emotional language. Colors, Harlan didn't have names for flowing in sequences that meant something he couldn't quite grasp. I watched it unfold, tried not to be overwhelmed, failed, tried again. Inhale, he whispered to himself. Exhale. Try not to accidentally insult an entire civilization. Standard procedure. The ceremony continued, phase after phase, precisely timed, almost mathematical. And then, a chime, soft, delicate, barely there. Harlan frowned. That wasn't in the schedule. He'd reviewed the acoustic markers for each phase. This one didn't belong. He glanced at his tablet. No alerts, no errors, everything functioning perfectly. Great, he whispered. Unexpected sounds. Love that. The chime came again, slightly offbeat, like a note played just a fraction too late. The way a heartbeat skips when the body is trying to tell you something your mind hasn't caught up to yet. The ambient light flickered, just barely, just enough that someone paying very close attention would notice. Harlan was always paying close attention. He looked across the hall. Lyora's shoulders tightened. Small movement, almost nothing. The kind of thing a camera wouldn't catch. The kind of thing 100 trained diplomats could easily miss. But Harlan didn't miss it, because he'd spent 5 years studying the anatomy of someone trying not to fall apart. Her breathing had changed. He couldn't hear it from here, but he could see it, the subtle quickening of her chest, the way her fingers pressed harder against her sides, the micro tremor running through her posture like a crack spreading through glass. Okay, he said under his breath. That's probably still none of your business. He shifted his stance, told himself firmly that he was exactly where he was supposed to be, that this was a controlled environment, that there were professionals here, highly trained individuals who understood protocol, culture, consequences. Unlike him. Definitely not your problem, he added quietly. His gaze drifted back to the child, drawn not by curiosity, by something far simpler. Recognition. The second chime was sharper, misaligned with the harmonic rhythm of the hall, like a wire pulled too tight. The living walls dimmed for a fraction of a second, like a blink, like the building itself had flinched. Nobody reacted. Of course they didn't. Diplomats were trained to ignore anything that wasn't officially acknowledged. Fires could probably start in the middle of the room, and half of them would politely wait for protocol to approve panic. Harlan shifted his weight, slower this time, eyes on the tablet, attention across the hall. Leora's posture had cracked, her shoulders drawn inward, trying to make herself smaller without actually moving. Her breathing visible now, uneven, shallow, the rhythm of someone whose body was running out of space to store fear. The attendants stood at measured distances, positioned like ornaments, their expressions composed, their focus forward. Not one of them moved. Not one of them looked directly at the child. Harlan blinked slowly. Really, he whispered, we're doing the pretend nothing is happening strategy, bold choice. Another chime. This one wavered, stretched longer than it should, like a signal struggling to stabilize. The ambient light shifted, didn't quite return to its original tone. The hall adjusted. Of course it did. It was designed to adapt. But the rhythm was off now. Not broken, just wrong. That's when Harlan heard it. Not through his earpiece, not through the translation systems, through the gap between two columns, where two senior Valorian officials stood with their backs half turned, speaking in tones low enough to be private, but not low enough for a man who had spent his career listening to frequencies most people ignored. The child is failing. Harlan's grip tightened on the tablet. If she cannot maintain composure through the emergent sequence, Draven will have his mandate. The Queen cannot intervene. Protocol forbids maternal interference during the trial. Then the trial will determine the outcome. As Draven intended, Harlan stood very still. Trial, not ceremony. Trial, the rite of emergence wasn't just a celebration. It was a test. The child, this small person standing in front of hundreds of delegates from three-star systems, was being evaluated. Could she control her emotions? Could she maintain composure under pressure that would buckle most adults? Could she prove, at whatever age she was, that she was worthy of the title she was born into? And if she couldn't, if she cracked, if she trembled, if she cried, someone named Draven would use that failure as a weapon against a child who had done nothing wrong except feel too much in a room designed to measure exactly that. Harlan's jaw tightened. A test. They had put a child in the center of a room in front of hundreds of people and told her to prove she was strong enough to deserve her own name. And if she couldn't, if the weight of it crushed her, if she did what any child would do under that kind of pressure, if she broke, then the breaking itself would be used against her, documented, cataloged, presented as evidence that she was less than what her bloodline required. Harlan had seen versions of this before, not on alien planets, on Earth, in boardrooms, in courtrooms, in schoolyards where children were told to be tough, while the adults who told them that stood at a safe distance and watched. The cruelty was never in the test itself, it was in the watching, the careful, measured watching that disguised itself as procedure. The officials continued. Seraphine knows. She has known since the rite was scheduled. Then why allow it? Because refusing would confirm what Draven already claims, that the child is unfit, that the Queen protects weakness rather than cultivating strength. A difficult position, an impossible one. Harlan exhaled through his nose. So that was it. The Queen was watching her daughter struggle, not because she didn't care, but because the rules of this world, this system, this culture, had been designed so precisely that caring publicly was the one thing she was forbidden to do. Leora wasn't just overwhelmed. She was alone. In a room full of hundreds of people, she was completely, entirely alone. Harlan looked at the child, and the child, without knowing it, looked exactly like him. Not physically, not in the details, but in the way that mattered, in the posture, in the eyes, in the desperate, invisible effort of a small person trying to hold the world together because the adults around her had decided that was her job. Nessa hadn't been asked to be brave at 6, but she had been, at the end. According to the report Harlan had read once, only once, because reading it a second time would have destroyed something inside him that he needed to keep functioning. She had been brave, and she had been alone, and he had been 4 systems away, standing in a room, holding a tablet, being the background person, just like right now. Harlan's hand trembled, just slightly, just enough that he felt it against the edge of the device. He closed his eyes. 1 second, 2, behind his eyelids, Nessa, calling for him, and him, not there. He opened his eyes. Leora's fingers curled at her sides, tight, white-knuckled, her whole body rigid with the effort of not breaking, the hall pulsing around her, off rhythm. The building itself confused by the storm happening inside a child. It was built to monitor, but not comfort. And nobody moved, nobody. Harlan exhaled, slow, controlled, a breath that did absolutely nothing to calm the small, stubborn part of his brain that had already made a decision without consulting the rest of him. No, he muttered softly. No, 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 stay here. You are a background person, a decorative human. You blend. You do not walk into royal situations uninvited. He paused, looked at the child, looked at the tablet in his hand. looked at the long, empty aisle between his column and where she stood. "This is a terrible idea," he whispered. "Genuinely, historically, terrible." He looked at the tablet in his hand, the device that was his entire reason for being in this room, his job, his function, his excuse for existing in this space without belonging to it. 3 pages of instructions, 27 behavioral guidelines, one emergency protocol, remain stationary, await extraction. He'd been doing that for 5 years, remaining stationary, awaiting extraction from a life that had stopped making sense the day a transport coupling failed at a junction point 4 systems away. And it had worked. The plan had worked. He had successfully remained stationary for 5 years, had successfully not gotten involved, had successfully not cared, had successfully not been present for anything or anyone, had successfully become the kind of man who could stand in a room and watch a child fall apart and do nothing. Except he couldn't. That was the problem. He couldn't. Because every time he looked at Lyora, he didn't see a princess or a political problem or a ceremonial complication. He saw a little girl, alone, in a room full of adults who had decided that her pain was less important than their procedure. And something in him, something he thought he'd buried deep enough that it would never surface again, rose up, quiet, stubborn, unignorable. The same something that used to wake him at 3 a.m. when Nessa had a fever. That made him drive 40 minutes in rain to pick her up from a birthday party where she'd gotten scared. That sat on the floor of her bedroom reading the same book 6 times in a row because she wanted the voices right. The father in him, still there, still alive, after everything. His feet didn't listen. They rarely did. 1 step, away from the column. 2 steps, into the open space. 3 steps, and now he was visible, exposed, a human, walking across the emergence hall during the most important ceremony this planet had seen in a decade, toward the Queen's daughter, without permission, without instruction, without any plan at all. "You're just repositioning," he told himself under his breath. "Humans reposition. It's normal, probably." The floor responded beneath his steps, adjusting, rippling faintly. The living architecture noticed him, tracked him. The columns near his path shifted their glow, not aggressively, just acknowledging. The building knew he was moving. Everyone would know soon. He didn't stop, because somewhere inside him, beneath the grief, beneath the humor he used like armor, beneath the 5 years of running, there was something that had never changed, a simple, stubborn, unshakable belief that when a child is afraid, you go to them. You don't wait for permission. You don't check protocol. You don't remain stationary and await extraction. You go because that is what you do, because that is what he should have done 5 years ago and couldn't and has never forgiven himself for. But today, right now, in this impossible room on this impossible planet surrounded by impossible people, he could be there. And so he walked, 1 foot, then the other. The tablet in his hand felt heavier now, not physically, but in every other way. It was the last piece of his old life, the thing he'd been holding instead of holding anything that mattered. A device, a tool, a small glowing rectangle that did nothing useful, that he'd clung to the way a man clings to a railing on a sinking ship. Not because the railing will save him, but because letting go means admitting the ship is going down. I didn't let go of it, not yet, but his grip loosened, just enough, toward the child, toward the part of himself he'd been trying to bury for half a decade. The part that knew how to sit on floors, how to make funny voices, how to check under beds for monsters with a flashlight and a completely serious expression. The part that could look a small, frightened person in the eye and say, "I'm here," and mean it with every cell in his body. That part, still there, after everything. I was 15 steps away now, then 10, then 5. The sound of the ceremony faded, not in volume, in importance. His focus narrowed, centered, on the small figure ahead. Lyora's breathing faster now. Her gaze dropped. the effort to remain still visible in the tension along her arms, in the slight tremor running through her shoulders. Harlan slowed, aware, very aware, that he was stepping into a space he had no authority to enter. "Okay," he whispered. "Last chance to turn around and pretend you dropped something." He did not turn around. Instead, he stopped a few steps away from her and lowered himself carefully to one knee. Not too fast, not too close, just enough to bring himself into her line of sight, without overwhelming it. The same height, eye to eye. The way you're supposed to be when you talk to a child. When you actually want them to hear you, not from above, not from a distance, but right there, right where they are, for a second. Nothing happened. The hall pulsed. The ceremony continued. The world kept turning. Then Lyora looked at him, her eyes wide, not with surprise, but with the fragile edge of something about to break. The look of someone who has been holding on so tightly, for so long, that one more second of kindness might be the thing that undoes them. Harlan knew that look too. He gave a small smile, not a big one. Big smiles could be alarming. He'd learned that, the hard way. "Hey," he said softly, low enough to stay between them. "I'm going to say something very unofficial right now." She blinked, confused, her attention catching on the unexpected tone more than the words. Good. Confusion was better than panic. Confusion meant the spiral had paused, even for a moment. "This ceremony," Harlan continued quietly, glancing around with exaggerated caution. "Way too long." A pause, very small, but enough. Leora's expression shifted, just slightly, caught between confusion and something lighter, something like the beginning of breathing again. And Harlan, on his knee, in the middle of an alien cathedral, talking to a princess he'd never met, felt, for the first time in 5 years, like he was exactly where he was supposed to be. Part 2, the man who knelt down silence. He had learned, was never empty. People thought it was. People thought silence meant nothing was happening, that the air was just air, that the space between two people was just space. But Harlan knew better. Silence was where the real things lived. The things too big for words. The things that crawled out only when you stopped talking long enough to let them. So he stayed quiet, on one knee, on the floor of a living building that could feel his heartbeat. In front of a child who was holding herself together with nothing but willpower and the desperate hope that nobody could see her cracking. He stayed, and he let the silence do what silence does. It breathed. Lyora's gaze remained on him, fixed, uncertain, her earlier panic now tangled with something else. Not trust, not yet, but the thing that comes just before trust. The cautious, tentative, almost willing suspension of fear that happens when someone shows up in the middle of your worst moment and doesn't leave. The tremor in her shoulders hadn't vanished, but it had softened, like a storm that had decided, reluctantly, to lose some of its wind. Harlan waited 3 more seconds, then spoke. "Okay," he said quietly, tilting his head just slightly. "New plan." Her brow furrowed. "We're not going to think about the ceremony at all." She blinked. "We're not—" "Nope." He said it like this was a perfectly reasonable rebellion against royal expectations. "As far as I'm concerned, none of this is happening." He gestured vaguely toward the vast glowing hall behind him. "This is all just decorative background noise." Lyora stared at him, clearly trying to process the concept of a human, on his knee, in the middle of the most important event on her planet, casually dismissing the entire thing with a wave of his hand. Harlan leaned in a little, lowered his voice conspiratorially. "Right now, we're just two people standing in a very strange room that hums like it's about to start singing." As if on cue, the walls pulsed, soft, rhythmic, almost melodic. Harlan paused, glanced upward. "Okay, that was suspiciously well-timed," he muttered. "I didn't rehearse that, I swear." A sound escaped Leora, small, fragile, not quite a laugh, but close enough to count. There it is, Harlan said softly, nodding once, as if confirming a complex calculation. That's a good sound. We're keeping that one. He shifted slightly, adjusted his posture so he wasn't looming, kept his movements slow, predictable. The last thing he wanted was to restart whatever emotional collapse had been building. You know, he continued, tone thoughtful, almost casual. On my world, when things get overwhelming, we have a very advanced technique. Lyora watched him, breathing still uneven, but no longer spiraling. It's called, Harlan said, raising a finger slightly, pretending you're somewhere else entirely. Her ears tilted, just a fraction, curiosity flickering through her expression. Somewhere else. Oh yes, extremely sophisticated, takes years of absolutely no training. Her lips pressed together, holding back something uncertain, but lighter. Harlan took that as encouragement. So, he went on, lowering his voice again, right now you're not here. Let's see. He glanced around as if searching the room for inspiration. You're on a quiet observation deck. No crowds, no ceremonies, just stars. Very calm stars. The kind that don't expect anything from you. Lyora's gaze shifted, drifted, just a little, following the idea rather than the environment. Harlan noticed immediately. Yeah, he said gently. That's a better place, right? She hesitated, then gave the smallest nod. Good, Harlan murmured. I'd go there too, honestly. This place is impressive, but it's a lot. He glanced around again, dropped his voice to a near whisper. Also, I'm pretty sure at least one of these walls is judging me. Lyora's eyes flicked to the nearest glowing structure, then back to him. I don't think they like me, Harlan added, dead serious. I walked in earlier and it dimmed slightly. That's not a good sign. This time the sound that escaped her was unmistakable. A quiet laugh, small, brief, but real. Harlan exhaled slowly, careful not to show how much that mattered. Because it mattered. More than anything had mattered to him in a very long time. Not because of the sound itself, because of what it meant. It meant she was still in there, still reachable, still a child underneath all the titles and expectations and ceremonial weight that had been stacked on her shoulders by people who should have known better. There we go, he said softly. You're doing great. Her shoulders lowered a fraction, tension easing in slow, uneven steps. Her hands, which had been clenched tight enough to leave marks, relaxed just enough for her fingers to uncurl. Harlan didn't rush it. He didn't push. He simply stayed. Try this, he said after a moment, voice calm, steady. Slow breath in, not a big one, just enough. He demonstrated, drawing in a quiet, controlled breath. Nothing dramatic, nothing therapeutic, just air, in, slowly. Lyora watched him, hesitated, then mirrored the motion. Her inhale was shaky, uneven, but it happened. Good, Harlan said immediately, nodding once. That's perfect. See, already better than me. I would have panicked and knocked something over by now. Her lips twitched. They stayed like that, breathing, quietly, steadily, while the grand ceremony continued around them, distant and irrelevant. The hall pulsed with its living light, hummed with its layered frequencies. But here, in this small, fragile pocket of calm, none of it mattered. Harlan kept his focus on her. Not the room, not the watching figures he could feel at the edges of his awareness. Just her. You're okay, he said softly, not as reassurance, as a simple statement. You're right here. Nothing else matters right now. Lyora's gaze met his, clearer this time, the earlier storm fading into something quieter, something almost like stillness. And for the first time since he had crossed the hall, Harlan allowed himself to think, just briefly, that maybe, somehow, he hadn't made a terrible mistake. Queen Seraphine had not moved since the second chime. To anyone watching, she remained exactly the same, poised, composed, an unshakable center within a carefully orchestrated system. Her posture did not shift. Her expression did not break. Her gaze remained directed forward, as protocol demanded. But the stillness was not absence. It was focus. She was watching, not directly, not in a way that would disrupt the ceremony or draw attention from the gathered delegates. But through the subtle layered awareness her kind had refined over centuries, the faint rings along her ears pulsed softly, responding to shifts in the hall's bioresonance structure. The building was whispering to her, translating the emotional fluctuations within its living framework. And right now, it was confused. Seraphine found that interesting. The rhythm of the ceremony had faltered, but not collapsed. The ambient harmonics were slightly misaligned, their usual precision replaced with something less predictable. The structure was adapting, recalibrating, in response to a variable it had not anticipated. A human. Her gaze shifted, just a fraction, enough to bring the scene at the edge of her perception into quiet focus. There he was, kneeling, speaking, completely ignoring protocol. Seraphine's eyes lingered on him, studying not just his actions, but the absence of hesitation within them. There was no sign of calculation, no awareness of consequence. He had crossed a boundary that others would not approach, and he had done so without permission, without instruction, without fear. Remarkable, she murmured, her voice barely audible. One of the advisors standing nearby stiffened, catching the word but not its meaning. Your Majesty. Seraphine did not look at them. Observe, she said softly. The advisor hesitated, then allowed their gaze to follow hers, finally noticing the disruption near the center of the hall. Their reaction was immediate. Tension, concern. The sharp flicker of alarm quickly masked beneath trained composure. The child, they began, lowering their voice. Should we intervene? No. The advisor blinked, uncertain. Seraphine tilted her head slightly, her ears shifting as the sensory rings adjusted, capturing more detail. The hall's resonance, its emotional mapping, had begun to stabilize. Not fully, not yet, but the chaotic fluctuations surrounding her daughter were smoothing, the sharp spikes of distress dissolving into something calmer, because of him. He has already intervened, Seraphine continued, tone even, almost thoughtful, and the result is effective. The advisor frowned faintly. He is not authorized, and yet he acts. Brief silence. His actions could be interpreted as inappropriate. A pause, then quietly. Seraphine asked, "Do you see fear in him?" The advisor glanced again, more closely this time. Harlan was still kneeling, still speaking in that quiet, unstructured way. There was no visible tension in his posture, no rigid awareness of the many eyes that could have been on him. No, the advisor admitted. Do you see ambition? Another pause. No. Seraphine's gaze softened, though only slightly. Then what you are observing is neither threat nor manipulation. The advisor hesitated. Then what is it? Seraphine did not answer immediately. Instead, she watched, as her daughter's shoulders lowered, as the tight, controlled stillness gave way to something more natural, as the child's breathing steadied. A small, almost imperceptible shift, but one Seraphine had waited to see for far too long. I have witnessed this moment before, she said at last, voice quieter now. Many times. The advisor's expression grew uncertain. My daughter, overwhelmed, her distress visible, her composure breaking. The advisor lowered their gaze. It is an unfortunate pattern. Yes, Seraphine said. A beat passed. And each time, those around her chose stillness. The words settled between them, heavy with meaning. He does not choose stillness, Seraphine said. Across the hall. Harlan shifted slightly, said something that caused the faintest flicker of amusement across Leora's face. Seraphine saw it. A small change. Almost nothing. But everything. The hall responded, its living structure adjusting, harmonics realigning with the calmer emotional field. the earlier dissonance fading, replaced by something steadier. "You did not see a princess," Seraphine murmured, so quiet that even the advisor beside her barely caught the words. "You saw a child." Her fingers moved subtly at her side, a controlled gesture. "Continue the ceremony," she instructed, without interruption. "Yes." They hesitated, then inclined their head. "As you command." The ritual resumed, the gathered delegates following the restored rhythm without question. To them, the disturbance had been minor, barely worth acknowledgement, but Seraphine remained where she was, her attention unwavering. She was no longer observing a disruption, she was observing a choice. And choices, she knew, were far more significant than protocol. Then Draven moved. Harlan didn't see it happen. He was still focused on Lyora, still talking in that quiet, steady tone, still keeping the small, fragile space between them intact. But he felt it, a shift in the air, the kind that happens when something organized and intentional begins moving through a crowd. Three figures, emerging from the perimeter, moving in formation, not rushing, not aggressive, but deliberate, purposeful. The kind of movement that said this has been decided without anyone needing to announce it. Valorian guards, tall, composed, their attire more structured than the delegates, the rings on their ears pulsing in tight synchronized patterns. They were heading straight for him. Harlan's stomach dropped. "Oh," he whispered, that's not great." Leora saw them too. Her eyes widened, the calm they'd built together flickering like a candle someone had breathed on too hard. "It's okay," Harlan said immediately, quietly, automatically, the way he'd said it to Nessa 1,000 times. During thunderstorms, during nightmares, during the small, everyday terrors of being 6 years old in a world that was too big. "It's okay, just breathe." But it wasn't okay, because behind the guards, following at a measured distance, was a figure Harlan hadn't noticed before. Tall, older, composed with a precision that went beyond training, into something more like ideology. His attire carried markings that Harlan's translation tablet identified as high council rank. The rings on his ears were darker than the others, almost black, pulsing with a slow, deliberate rhythm that felt less like communication and more like control. Draven. Harlan didn't know the name yet, but he knew the type. Every organization had one. Every system. Every room where power collected. The person who had decided long ago that rules existed to serve their purpose, and that anyone who deviated from those rules was either a threat, a tool, or irrelevant. Draven stopped 10 paces behind the guards. "I didn't need to be closer." Men like Draven never needed to be close. Distance was the tool. The ability to set things in motion without touching them. To dismantle without dirtying your hands. To watch the pieces fall from far enough away that you could claim you never pushed them. Harlan had known men like this on Earth. In offices, in institutions, in every system that valued order over people. The ones who never raised their voices, never lost their temper, never once showed anything that could be identified as cruelty. Because what they did was never cruel. It was policy. It was procedure. It was the way things were done. And if people got hurt, well, that was unfortunate. But the system was sound. Always the system was sound. Draven was that. Distilled, refined, elevated to a level of authority that made the pattern not just acceptable, but admirable. He was not a villain. He was something worse. He was a man who had genuinely convinced himself that control was kindness, that structure was love, that a child who couldn't perform composure on command was a problem to be solved rather than a person to be held. His voice carried, not loudly, not dramatically, but with the kind of authority that comes from decades of being obeyed without question. "The human is in violation of ceremonial protocol," he said, "to no one in particular, to everyone. He is to be escorted from the princess's presence immediately, for her protection." Protection. Harlan heard the word, understood immediately what it actually meant. Not protection, removal. Because Lyora had been failing. and Draven had been watching, waiting, counting the seconds until her composure shattered publicly, until he had what he needed: proof, evidence, a visible, undeniable moment of weakness that he could present to the council. And then Harlan had walked into the middle of it and calmed her down and ruined everything. So now, new approach: remove the human, frame it as protocol, frame it as concern, and in the chaos of the removal, the child would break again, and this time, no one would be close enough to stop it. Harlan understood all of this in about 4 seconds, which was 3 seconds more than he needed. Right, he muttered under his breath. So that's what this is. The guards were close now. 5 meters, 4. Leora grabbed his sleeve. Not his hand, his sleeve. The way a child grabs the nearest solid thing when the ground shifts. Instinctive, unthinking. The kind of contact that means everything precisely because it wasn't planned. Harlan felt it. The small fingers, the slight tremor, the weight of a child choosing trust for the first time in what was probably a very long time. And something inside him, something old and broken and carefully sealed shut, cracked open, not with pain, with clarity. Because this was it. This was the moment. The one he'd missed 5 years ago. The one that had replayed in his nightmares ever since. The moment someone small needed him. And he was here. He was actually, finally, here. Harlan did not stand up. He did not turn around. He placed his hand gently over Leora's fingers on his sleeve, and he stayed exactly where he was. I'm not going anywhere, he said softly. To her. Only to her. I promise. The guards were 3 meters away now. 2. One reached forward, and then the hall changed. It started with a sound. Not a chime this time, not a harmonic. Something deeper. Something that came from the architecture itself. From the floor, from the columns, from every living surface in the hall simultaneously. A tone. Low, resonant, absolute. The kind of sound a building makes when it is no longer adapting, when it is responding. Every person in the hall felt it. The delegates, the officials, the guards, even Draven, whose composure flickered for just a fraction of a second before resettling. Because the tone was not random, it was announcement. The living architecture of Valoria did not serve individuals. It served truth. It measured emotional authenticity. It responded to intention. And right now, in this moment, it had measured something in the room and decided to speak. The guards stopped, not because they were ordered to, because the hall told them to. The columns nearest to Harlan and Leora brightened, slowly, steadily, their violet glow deepening into something warmer, richer. The floor beneath them stabilized completely. The harmonic resonance around them shifted from uncertainty into something coherent. The building was not confused anymore. It had found what it was looking for: authenticity. And it had found it in the most unlikely place in the room. In a human, on his knee, holding a child's hand, meaning every word he said. Draven's jaw tightened. This changes nothing, he said. Quieter now, but sharper. Protocol is clear. The human is under my observation. Every head in the hall turned. Queen Seraphine, walking, not quickly, not urgently, but with a kind of deliberate clarity that made the entire room feel like it was quietly rearranging itself around her. She moved through the space between delegates, each step precise, unhurried, her attire catching the living light, the rings on her ears pulsing in a rhythm that Harlan suddenly realized was different from the hall's. Her own rhythm. The building adjusted to her, not the other way around. Draven straightened. Your Majesty, the human has violated the sanctity of... I am aware of what the human has done, Seraphine said, not raising her voice, not needing to. The silence that followed was the entire diplomatic body of 3 star systems holding its collective breath. Seraphine continued walking, past the guards, who parted, not because they were told to, because the alternative was standing in the path of a queen who had decided to move. Past Draven, whose expression remained controlled, but whose hands, Harlan noticed, had tightened at his sides. Toward Harlan, who was still on one knee, still holding a child's fingers on his sleeve, still existing, barely. "Oh," he whispered. "Oh no." His brain, usually quite helpful in stressful situations, chose this exact moment to offer nothing of value. "Okay," he muttered. Think. Think of something intelligent to say." "Nothing." "Great, perfect, excellent timing." Seraphine stopped in front of him. Close. Closer than protocol would normally allow. Close enough that the subtle field around her became noticeable. A faint distortion in the air, like reality bending slightly to accommodate her. Her gaze lowered to meet his. Not cold, not warm, clear. The kind of clarity that doesn't judge, that simply sees everything, all at once, without flinching. Harlan swallowed. "Your Majesty," he started, because that felt safe. It was also the only part of the sentence he managed to complete, because Seraphine reached him and kissed him. The world stopped, not metaphorically, not poetically, actually stopped. Harlan's thoughts didn't slow, didn't scatter, didn't spiral. They stopped, like a machine hitting a wall, like a clock with no hands, like the space between heartbeats. Except the next heartbeat forgot to happen. The kiss was brief, controlled, precise in a way that suggested no uncertainty at all. There was no hesitation in the gesture, no visible doubt. It happened with the same quiet authority as everything else she did, as if it were simply the correct action in that moment. And then it was over. She stepped back. The hall, which had already forgotten how to function normally, now seemed to forget the concept of sound entirely. Harlan remained on his knee, existing, barely. "Okay," his brain said, very calmly, very distantly. That happened. He did not move. He did not blink. For a brief and highly questionable moment, he was completely disconnected from reality. Then reality returned, all at once. "Oh," he said. A pause. "Oh." That was, unfortunately, the full extent of his immediate response. Somewhere behind him, a very distant part of his awareness registered that someone had inhaled sharply. Possibly several people. Possibly the entire diplomatic body of three-star systems. Harlan ignored that, mostly because he couldn't process anything beyond the immediate challenge of existing in his own body. His brain, which had been mostly useless for the last 30 seconds, finally managed to produce a coherent thought. "She kissed you." "Yes. Thank you." He was aware. A queen kissed you, also aware, in front of everyone. Very aware. You should probably say something. He was working on it. Something good. He was really working on it. His hands were shaking, just slightly, not with fear, not with anything he could name. Something else. Something that felt like the moment before a thunderstorm. When the air changes and your body knows something is coming before your mind does. He looked at his hands, looked at them shake, and thought, distantly, absurdly, that this was the first time they had shaken for a reason that wasn't grief. Seraphine regarded him steadily, her expression unchanged, if anything. A faint shift in her gaze, something quieter, more focused, as if she were observing the result of an experiment she had conducted with complete confidence in its necessity. Harlan swallowed. "Right," he said softly. "I feel like I missed a step." Pause. Several steps, actually. Still nothing from the room, still nothing from her. "Okay," he continued, because apparently he was still capable of speech. "Just to clarify, was that a cultural thing?" He winced immediately. That was not the best question, he admitted under his breath. But it was too late. The words were out, floating in the vast, silent hall, being analyzed by multiple translation systems, and at least one highly judgmental building. Seraphine tilted her head slightly. The rings along her ears flickered. "You acted," she said, calm, clear, not loud, but carrying effortlessly through the space. "Yes," Harlan said carefully, That does appear to be something I did. You saw her distress. You did not wait. No, waiting didn't seem helpful. A brief pause, then, very slightly. Something changed in her expression. Not a smile, not quite, but something close enough. Correct, she said. Harlan exhaled a breath he hadn't known he was holding. Good, he murmured. That's good. He glanced at Lyora. She was watching them now, no longer tense, no longer overwhelmed, just present, observing. The way children do when they're witnessing something they don't fully understand but know is important. Harlan looked back at Seraphine. I was just trying to help, he said. Quieter now. That's all. Seraphine studied him for a moment longer. I know, she said, and the way she said it, those two words, made Harlan realize she had known from the beginning, had seen everything, understood everything, and had walked across that hall not because she needed to evaluate him, but because she had already finished evaluating him. And this, the kiss, was the verdict. Draven did not leave. Of course he didn't. Men like Draven never left. They redistributed, recalculated, reframed. They found new angles of approach, the way roots find cracks in concrete. Patient, relentless, absolutely certain that persistence was the same thing as being right. The ceremony resumed, seamlessly, as if the moment had been quietly absorbed into the fabric of the event, categorized somewhere within Valorian logic as acceptable deviation. Harlan stood up, finally. His knee ached, which felt absurdly human given the circumstances. Lyora stood beside him, calmer now, her posture natural, relaxed. She glanced at him, then at the hall, then back at him. Are we in trouble? She asked softly. Harlan considered that. Yes, he said honestly. Pause, but in a calm, dignified way. She blinked at him. I think, he added, nodding once. This is the kind of trouble where no one yells, but everything becomes very formal and slightly terrifying. That earned him a small, uncertain smile. Good news, Harlan continued quietly. You're doing great, way better than me. I'm about 2 seconds from apologizing to the floor. Her lips pressed together, holding back a faint laugh. Harlan exhaled slowly, let his gaze drift across the hall. The ceremony was winding toward its final phase, the living light cascading through its closing sequences, the delegates resuming their careful, composed existence, everything returning to normal. Except nothing was normal, because Draven was watching, and Harlan could feel it. The way you feel cold air finding the gap in a coat. Not painful yet, but present, persistent. The kind of attention that said, this is not over. The final harmonic faded, the ceremony completed. People began to move, conversations resumed. Harlan stood where he was, still processing, and that's when the escort appeared. Not guards this time, an attendant, composed, polite. The kind of politeness that was somehow more alarming than hostility. You are requested in the council chamber, the attendant said. Harlan blinked. Requested? Yes. By whom? The council. The whole council? Yes. Harlan nodded slowly. And this is the good kind of requested, or the kind where I should be memorizing escape routes? The attendant paused, just barely. I would not recommend attempting to leave the building, they said. Great, Harlan murmured. Very reassuring. Thank you. He followed them. Through corridors that curved and glowed and felt increasingly like the interior of something alive, which they were. He was walking through a living organism, toward a meeting with people who could probably end his career, his freedom, and possibly his existence with 3-star systems worth of diplomatic paperwork. The council chamber was smaller than the emergence hall, but no less impressive. A circular room, the walls pulsing with a softer, more focused light. A long curved table, occupied by 9 figures, each one radiating the kind of authority that made Harlan want to check if his shirt was tucked in. Seraphine was not among them, but Draven was. Seated at the center of the curve, his dark rings catching the ambient light, his expression composed, pleasant even, which was, Harlan realized, far more dangerous than anger. Please, Draven said, gesturing to a position at the center of the room. Stand there. Harlan walked to the indicated spot. He stood. He waited. The silence stretched. You are Harlan, Draven said. Not a question. That's me. Technical translator, contract basis, Earth origin, currently on your final assignment. Also me, Draven's gaze held steady. Do you understand what occurred in the emergence hall today? Harlan considered his options. Honesty seemed like the safest bet, which was terrifying, because honesty and safety did not usually end up in the same room in his experience. I saw a child who was struggling, he said. I went to her. I talked to her. She calmed down. You violated ceremonial protocol. Yes. You entered a restricted ceremonial space. Yes. You made physical proximity with a member of the royal family without authorization. She grabbed my sleeve, but yes, a very slight tightening around Draven's eyes. And you are aware that any of these actions, individually, could constitute grounds for formal diplomatic complaint. Yes, Harlan said. I'm aware. And yet you proceeded. Yes. Why? And there it was, the question. Harlan looked at Draven, at the dark rings, at the composed face, at the careful architecture of a man who had built his entire career on the principle that emotion was weakness, that control was strength, that a child who couldn't hold herself together in front of hundreds of strangers was a liability rather than a person. Because she needed someone, Harlan said, simply, and no one was going. Draven studied him. Sentiment, he said, the word delivered like a diagnosis. Sure, Harlan replied. Call it that. Draven's gaze didn't waver. If anything, it sharpened, the way a blade sharpens when you draw it slowly across stone. Not in a hurry, just getting ready. On this world, Draven said, sentiment is a luxury, not a strategy. On my world too, Harlan said. Doesn't mean it's wrong. It means it's unreliable, unpredictable, uncontrolled. Sounds like most of the best things people do. A very subtle tightening at the corners of Draven's mouth. Not a smile, not a frown, something in between. The expression of a man who was not used to being answered and was deciding how much patience he was willing to spend. And sentiment without understanding of consequence. I understood the consequences, and yet you acted anyway. Yes. Draven leaned back slightly. Then you are either remarkably brave or remarkably foolish. Harlan almost smiled. In my experience, he said, those are usually the same thing. A flicker crossed Draven's expression. Something cold, calculated. The look of a man recalibrating in real time. Regardless of your intentions, Draven continued, your actions created a disruption, and disruptions, in this context, have consequences. He paused. However, the Queen has complicated matters. How so? What the Queen did, Draven said, slowly, precisely, was not a personal gesture. Harlan waited. In Valorian custom, what you received is called the Ardal Sen, the mark of recognition. Harlan blinked. It is an ancient practice, rarely invoked, the act by which a member of the royal house formally acknowledges an individual as worthy of the crown's protection. Harlan's brain processed this, slowly. Protection, he repeated. The mark designates its recipient as a keeper, a formal protector of the royal house. It is irrevocable once witnessed by a ceremonial assembly. Harlan stared at him. I'm sorry, he said, very carefully. Are you telling me that the Queen just made me some kind of official, royal, protector? Yes. Me. Yes. The tablet guy. A long pause. The designation is not one I would have recommended, Draven said, and for the first time. His composure showed the faintest crack. Not anger, frustration. The kind that comes from watching a carefully constructed plan get dismantled by someone who wasn't even trying. 200 years, Draven added, quieter, almost to himself. 200 years since the last invocation, and she gives it to a man who was holding a tablet. Harlan opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. To be fair, he said, it's a very nice tablet. Nobody laughed. He hadn't expected them to. But somewhere, in the faint ambient hum of the building, he could have sworn the walls brightened. Just a fraction. The building thought it was funny. At least someone did. Harlan stood there, in the council chamber, on a planet he'd never visited before today, having just been told that because a queen kissed him, in front of hundreds of diplomats from three-star systems. He was now, officially, formally, irrevocably important. Okay, he said, quietly, to himself. That's new. He looked around the chamber, 9 faces looking back at him, some curious, some skeptical, some hostile, and Draven, at the center, watching with the patient, steady focus of someone who had just lost a battle, but not the war. You will be expected to remain on Valoria, Draven continued, until the council determines the full implications of the mark. Remain, Harlan repeated. As in, stay? Yes. For how long? Indefinitely. Harlan nodded, slowly, processing, or trying to. His last assignment, his final job, the one quiet ceremony before he went home, before he disappeared into an empty apartment and spent the rest of his life not being present, not being needed, not being anything to anyone, and instead, this. He thought about the transport, still docked, still waiting, his passage home already booked, his contract ending in 14 hours. He thought about the empty apartment, the small shoes by the door. I thought about Lyora, grabbing his sleeve, trusting him, without knowing why. And for the first time in 5 years, something inside his chest moved. Not the grief. That was still there, would always be there, but something next to it, something that had been waiting. He didn't know what it was yet, but it was there. Okay, he said again, softly, looking at no one in particular. So, new situation, very new situation. He paused. I came here to hold a tablet, and now I'm a keeper. He let that sit. I don't even know what a keeper does. Draven's expression tightened, a question that concerns us as well. Harlan looked at him, directly, without flinching. Then I guess we'll figure it out, he said. And standing in that room, on a planet that could feel his heartbeat, after the strangest day of his entire unremarkable life, he wasn't afraid, he wasn't brave either. He was just there, present, which, it turned out, was enough. Part 3, The Man Who Chose to Stay, 3 days. That's how long it took for Draven to file the formal challenge. 3 days of Harlan wandering through the living corridors of the Valorian Palace, trying to look like he knew where he was going, failing, consistently. The building kept rearranging itself. Or maybe it didn't. Maybe he was just bad at directions on planets where the walls breathed. Either way, he was lost. Again. Okay, he muttered, staring at a corridor that definitely hadn't been there 5 minutes ago. I've been here before, or this looks like where I've been before, or everything looks the same because this entire building is alive and messing with me. The wall pulsed faintly. I saw that, Harlan said. It pulsed again, slightly brighter. Great. We're communicating. Wonderful. He turned left, found a dead end, turned around, found a different dead end. I am a keeper of the royal house, he said to no one, and I cannot find the dining hall. A soft chime echoed from somewhere above him. Almost like a laugh. He chose not to think about that. 3 days, and in those 3 days, Harlan had learned several things. First, the title of Keeper carried weight, significant weight. Doors opened when he approached, literally. The building recognized his designation and adjusted accordingly. People addressed him differently, not with warmth exactly, more like caution. The way you'd address a package that might be fragile, or explosive. They weren't sure which yet. Second, nobody actually knew what to do with him. The mark of recognition hadn't been invoked in over 200 years. The last keeper had been Valorian, not human, not alien, not a contract technician who had been on the planet for less than 12 hours when the designation occurred. There was no manual for this. There was no precedent. There was just Harlan, standing in hallways he couldn't navigate, holding a title he didn't understand, on a planet where the floor had feelings. Third, and this was the one that sat heaviest, Lyora kept finding him, not in an official way, not through channels or protocol or scheduled interactions. She just appeared in corridors, in the observation rooms, in the garden spaces where the architecture grew into something less structured and more wild. She'd show up, stand nearby, and wait. The first time it happened, Harlan hadn't known what to do. She had simply stood 3 meters away, watching him with that careful, measured gaze that children develop when they've learned that adults are unpredictable. And the safest strategy is observation before engagement. Harlan had looked at her, looked at the corridor, looked back at her. "I'm lost," he'd said. "I know," she'd replied. "You've passed this section 4 times. You've been counting. The building has been counting." He'd paused. "Is that normal for buildings to count things?" "It counts everything. Everything. Your heart rate increased by 12% when you turned the wrong corner the 3rd time." Harlan had stared at her. "That feels like a violation of privacy. The building doesn't understand privacy. Neither do most of my former coworkers. But still," she'd almost smiled. Almost. And then she'd turned and walked, and Harlan had followed, because she clearly knew where she was going, and he clearly did not. She led him to the dining hall, didn't say a word the entire way, just walked, and occasionally glanced back to make sure he was still there, which hit Harlan so hard he had to stop walking for a second. Just stand there in the corridor, letting the feeling pass through him, or trying to. It didn't pass. It settled, right in the center of his chest, where all the heavy things lived, because that was what he used to do. Walk ahead, glance back, make sure the small person behind him was keeping up. Except he'd been the one doing it. With Nessa. In grocery stores, on sidewalks, through parks where she stopped every 4 steps to examine something invisible on the ground. He'd glance back. She'd be there. Always. Until she wasn't. And now here was this child, doing the same thing. In reverse. Leading him. Checking. Making sure he didn't disappear. Harlan had eaten dinner that night in the Valorian dining hall, surrounded by food he didn't recognize, at a table designed for bodies taller than his, under a ceiling that hummed. And he hadn't felt lonely, for the first time in 5 years. He hadn't felt lonely. He didn't know what to do with that. So he did nothing, which, he was starting to realize, was its own kind of doing something. On the 2nd day, she found him in one of the garden corridors, a space where the architecture loosened, where the rigid precision of the palace gave way to something more organic. Vines, or what Harlan assumed were vines. They glowed faintly, pulsing with the same rhythm as the rest of the building, but slower, calmer. He was sitting on a bench, or what he assumed was a bench. It might have been part of the wall. The line between furniture and architecture was blurry here. Leora sat down beside him. Not close, not far. The exact distance a child maintains when they want to be near someone, but haven't decided how near yet. They sat in silence for a while. Then Leora said, "You're sad." Not a question. Harlan looked at her. "The building told you that?" "No, I can see it." He paused. "I'm not sad right now." "Not right now. Underneath." Harlan stared at her. Children, he had forgotten, don't have the same filters adults do. They don't soften observations, don't package them in polite language. They just see things and say them with the blunt precision of a surgical instrument. "Yeah," he said after a moment. "Underneath, I'm a little sad." "About what?" He considered lying, considered deflecting, considered making a joke about the building judging him. Instead, he said, I miss someone. Lyora nodded, as if this was a perfectly normal thing to say on a bench in a garden corridor on an alien planet. I miss my father sometimes, she said. Harlan looked at her, surprised, not by the sentiment, by the fact that she had offered it, unprompted, unguarded. Your father. He died before I was old enough to remember him, but I miss the idea of him. She said it simply, the way children talk about big things, without the layers of complexity that adults add, without the armor. My mother doesn't talk about him, she continued, not because she doesn't want to, because it hurts. Harlan was quiet for a long time. Yeah, he said finally, that's how it works. They sat there, in the garden, under the glowing vines, and said nothing else. But the silence, Harlan noticed, was the kind that doesn't need words because the words have already been said. On the third day, Harlan asked Lyora a question. Do you always do that? Do what? Find people. She considered this. Only people who are lost. I'm not the only one. You're the most lost, she said. Matter of fact. Harlan laughed, a real laugh, short, rough. The kind that catches you off guard because it's been so long since the last one that you've forgotten what it sounds like. Lyora looked at him, with an expression that was part surprise and part triumph. Good sound, she said, echoing his words from the emergence hall. And Harlan, standing in a corridor he definitely couldn't find again. On a planet he still didn't understand, felt something crack inside him. Not break, crack. The way ice cracks in spring, when the thing underneath is ready to move again. The summons arrived on the morning of the fourth day. An attendant, the same polite, terrifying variety as before, standing at Harlan's door with a tablet that contained a single line of text. Formal challenge to the Ardal Sen, filed by Council Senior Draven. Hearing convened at the ninth harmonic cycle. Harlan read it twice. What's the ninth harmonic cycle in human time? Approximately 3 hours. 3 hours. He nodded. Is that enough time to learn Valorian law? The attendant paused. Valorian legal tradition spans roughly 14,000 documented cycles. So, no. No, Harlan sighed. What happens if the challenge succeeds? The mark is voided. Your designation as keeper is dissolved. You would be reclassified. Reclassified as what? A delicate pause. An unauthorized foreign agent who violated ceremonial protocol in the presence of the royal family. And what happens to unauthorized foreign agents? The pause was longer this time. They are removed from the planet. Removed, Harlan repeated. Politely or. The distinction is largely procedural. That's not a no. The attendant inclined their head. I would suggest attending the hearing. Yeah, Harlan murmured. I figured. He stood in his quarters after the attendant left, looking at the room that had been his for 3 days. The walls glowed softly, warmly, as if the building had been trying, in its strange, responsive way, to make him comfortable. The transport was still docked. He'd checked. Twice, Soren had kept it waiting. Just in case, he'd said during their last call. You can still come home, Harlan. The contract's done. Nobody would blame you. Home. That word again. He could leave. Right now. Walk to the docking bay. Board the transport. Be in hyperspace before the hearing even started. Gone. Clean. Safe. The way he'd been safe for 5 years. The way running was safe. The way empty rooms and distant planets and never staying long enough to matter was safe. He looked at his hands, steady for the moment. He thought about Lyora, standing in the corridor, counting his wrong turns, leading him to dinner without a word. He thought about the way she'd grabbed his sleeve. He sat down on the edge of the bed, put his face in his hands, and for the first time since Nessa died, he didn't run from the feeling. He let it arrive. It came like weather, not a storm, not a collapse, just rain. The slow, steady kind that soaks everything without making a sound. He breathed. In, out, shaky, uneven, but real. He thought about Nessa, The way she used to put her hand flat against his chest and say, "I can hear your heart, Daddy." I thought about the call he didn't answer, the transport he wasn't on, the empty space where his presence should have been. And then, very quietly, he thought about something else. Not what he'd lost, but what he'd found. On his knees, in a living hall, talking to a child who was drowning in plain sight. He lifted his head. The walls of his room pulsed gently, steady, calm. "Okay," he said, out loud, to the room, to himself, to whatever part of the universe was listening. "I'm staying," he paused, "for the hearing. I'm staying for the hearing." Another pause. "We'll figure out the rest later." The wall brightened, just slightly. "Stop that," Harlan said. It didn't stop. The tribunal hall was different from the emergence hall. Smaller, darker, more focused. The architecture here didn't pulse with warm light. It glowed with something cooler, more precise. The kind of illumination designed not for beauty, but for truth. Harlan walked in and felt the difference immediately. This room was watching. Not in the gentle ambient way the rest of the building watched. This room was paying attention, actively, deliberately, every surface calibrated to detect emotional authenticity, every column tuned to register deception. The bioresponsive lattice here wasn't a backdrop, it was a witness. Harlan stood at the center, the 9 council members, plus additional officials, delegates who had remained on Valoria specifically for this hearing, and Draven, standing at the front of the curved table, his dark rings pulsing with slow, deliberate authority, his expression serene, the composure of a man who had spent 3 days preparing for exactly this moment. "The challenge is filed under Article 17 of the Valorian Accords," Draven began, not rushed, not dramatic. The measured pace of someone who understood that control of rhythm was control of outcome. "The Ardhal Sen, the mark of recognition, has been invoked under unprecedented circumstances. The recipient is not Valorian, not allied, not credentialed. He is a contract worker, a technician, a temporary presence on this world with no legal standing, no cultural comprehension, and no authorization to interact with members of the royal family." He paused. Let the words settle. "The mark requires that its recipient demonstrate an authentic commitment to the protection of the crown. The question before this council is simple." He turned his gaze to Harlan. "Can a man who does not understand our world, our customs, our history, possibly serve as its protector?" Silence. Harlan said nothing, not because he had nothing to say, but because he'd learned, in 3 days of living inside a building that could feel lies, that sometimes the most honest thing you could do was let the silence carry its own weight. Draven continued, "I do not question the human's intentions." That surprised Harlan, slightly. His actions in the emergence hall were, by all accounts, genuine. He saw a child in distress. He responded. A pause. But sincerity is not qualification. There it was. A physician who means well but lacks training is still dangerous. A pilot with good intentions who cannot fly still crashes. Sentiment, without competence, without understanding, without belonging, is not enough. Draven's voice carried the weight of someone who believed every word, not because he was performing, but because in his framework, in the system he had built his life around, he was right. And that was what made him dangerous. Not malice, not cruelty, certainty. The absolute unshakable certainty that rules and structure and control were more important than the messy, unpredictable business of caring. The mark should be voided, Draven concluded, and the human returned to his point of origin, with respect, with gratitude, and with clarity that his place is not here. Silence again. The council members shifted, some nodding slightly, some uncertain. The argument was clean, logical, built on precedent and principle. It was also, Harlan knew, completely missing the point. The presiding council member, an older Valorian whose rings carried a faded silver tone, turned to Harlan. You may respond. Harlan looked at them. He didn't have a speech prepared. He didn't have legal arguments. He didn't have 3 days of careful strategic planning. He had himself. I don't understand your world, he said. Simply. That's true, he paused. I don't know your customs. I couldn't name 3 articles of your legal code. I can't navigate the building I've been living in for 3 days. I got lost on the way to this hearing. Twice. A very faint ripple of something passed through the room. Not quite amusement, but adjacent to it. I'm a technician. I hold tablets. I calibrate things. That's what I've done for 3 years across half a dozen worlds. And before that, before any of this. He paused, breathed. I was a father. The room changed, not in the light, not in the architecture, in the quality of attention. The way a room shifts when someone stops speaking from their head and starts speaking from somewhere deeper. I had a daughter, Harlan continued, voice steady, carefully steady. Her name was Nessa. She was 6. She died in a transport accident 5 years ago, and I was 4 systems away, doing a job just like this one, holding a tablet, being the background person. He paused. I wasn't there. The walls of the tribunal pulsed, very softly, responding to something the room's emotional sensors had detected, something raw, something that could not be fabricated. So when I stood in that hall, Harlan said, and I saw that child, your princess, standing there, falling apart, and nobody moving, nobody going to her. His voice caught, just barely, just enough to be real. I didn't think about protocol. I didn't think about consequences. I didn't think about anything. He looked at Draven. I just couldn't stand there again and do nothing. Again. Silence. Long. Deep. Filling the room completely. You're right, Harlan continued, addressing Draven directly now. I don't understand your world. I don't know your laws. I can't recite your history or perform your customs or navigate your buildings. He paused. But I know what it looks like when a child is alone, and I know what it costs to pretend you don't see it. He paused, looked around the room, at the 9 faces, at the officials, at the walls that were listening, that were always listening. You want to know if I can protect this house, this crown, this world? He shook his head slightly. I don't know. Probably not. I don't have the training. I don't have the knowledge. I don't have any of the things that would make me qualified. He stopped, let the words settle. But I know what it feels like to fail someone small. I know what it feels like to be 4 systems away when the person who needed you most was calling your name. I know what it feels like to carry that. Every day, every hour, every second of every assignment on every planet for 5 years. His voice didn't break, but it bent. The way a tree bends in wind, still standing, still holding, but showing the force of what was pushing against it. And I know with absolute certainty that I will never, ever stand in a room and watch a child suffer and choose to be still. He looked at Draven. That's not a qualification, I know that, but it's the truth. And in a room that was built to hear truth, I think that matters. The tribunal hall pulsed again, brighter this time. The columns nearest to Harlan shifting in hue, from cool precision to something warmer. Draven's expression did not change, but his hands, very slightly, tightened. The presiding member leaned forward. The council will deliberate, wait. Every head turned, because the voice came from the entrance. Small, clear, certain in a way that contradicted everything about the size of the person it belonged to. Princess Leora, standing in the doorway of the tribunal hall, alone, without escort, without attendants, without any of the ceremonial structure that was supposed to surround a member of the royal family at all times. She had come by herself. Draven straightened. The princess has no standing in this proceeding. The princess, the presiding member said carefully, is the subject of the events under discussion. Her perspective, while irregular, may be relevant. Draven's jaw tightened. She is a child. She is the heir. A beat of silence. Leora walked into the room, not hesitantly, not nervously, with the kind of deliberate measured steps that Harlan recognized from the emergence hall. The same posture, the same control, but different. Because this time, it wasn't fear holding her together, it was choice. She stopped at the center of the room, near Harlan, but not beside him. Her own space, her own position. And she looked at the council. "I want to say something," she said. The presiding member nodded. Lyora's hands were at her sides. Still, but not clenched, not white-knuckled, just sting. "On the day of the emergence," she began, voice clear, steady enough for a child standing in front of the most powerful people on her planet. "I was afraid." Simple words. But in this room, in this building, where every surface was calibrated to detect truth, they landed hard. "I have been afraid many times," she continued, "at ceremonies, at formal events, at moments when I am required to be composed." She paused. "Each time, I am afraid, and each time, the people around me are still." The words sat heavy in the air, echoing everything Seraphine had said to her advisor in the emergence hall, as if the observation had traveled through the architecture, through the bloodline, and arrived here, in her daughter's voice. "They are still because they are trained, because protocol tells them to be still, because stillness is what this world values." Lyora looked at Draven, directly, without flinching. But stillness is not the same as care. The room did not breathe. On that day, there were hundreds of people in the hall, delegates, officials, advisors, guards. My mother. Her voice caught, just barely, just for a fraction. And none of them came. She turned her gaze to Harlan. He did. 2 words. The building responded, not subtly this time. The columns in the tribunal brightened, a warm, resonant pulse rippling through the bioresponsive lattice. The hall's emotional mapping registering something it recognized with absolute precision. Truth, unfiltered, unperformed, the kind that a child carries because they haven't yet learned to complicate it. "He is not Valorian," Lyora continued. "He does not know our customs. He did not have permission." She paused. "He came anyway." Her eyes, clear, focused, carrying the weight of something that should not have been asked of someone her age, but was. "He was the only one who saw me," she said. "Not the princess, not the heir, not the subject of the emergence trial." Her voice steadied. "Me." The hall held the word the way a bell holds its tone, vibrating, echoing through every surface, through every sensor, through every person in the room who had spent their entire career learning to be still. And for a moment, just a moment, the stillness broke, not with sound or motion, but in the way a frozen thing thaws, slowly, starting from the center. Draven spoke, one more time, his voice controlled, but different now, tighter. The composure still there, but the certainty underneath it, cracked, just slightly. "The child's testimony, while moving, does not address the legal question before this council." Leora looked at him, directly, and said nothing. She didn't need to, because the building was still glowing, warm, steady, responding to the truth she had placed in the center of the room. Truth that could not be argued away, could not be filed under precedent, could not be dismissed with procedure. The presiding member looked at Draven, then at Leora, then at Harlan, then at the columns, still pulsing, still warm. "The building," the presiding member said slowly, "has rendered its assessment." Draven's expression flickered. "The building is not a legal authority." "The building," the presiding member replied, "is the oldest authority on Valoria. It was here before the council, before the accords, before the mark itself. It measures what we cannot legislate and what it is measuring now. In this room is not a disruption." Draven said nothing, because there was nothing to say. The room had made its decision, not the council, not the politicians, not the carefully constructed arguments built on centuries of tradition. The room, the living, breathing, watching room, had chosen its side. Harlan looked at Leora, and Leora looked back at him, and neither of them needed to say anything else. The presiding member called for a recess. Harlan stood in a corridor outside the tribunal, leaning against a wall that was definitely judging him, his heart rate broadcasting to every surface in the building. He didn't care. Leora had been escorted to a separate waiting area. Protocol. Of course, even when a child had just dismantled a political challenge with 12 sentences, Protocol still had opinions about where she should stand afterward. Harlan closed his eyes. Footsteps. He opened them. Queen Seraphine, walking toward him, alone, without attendants, without advisors, without any of the layered ceremonial presence that usually surrounded her. Just a woman, walking down a corridor, toward a man leaning against a wall. Harlan straightened, automatically, then stopped himself, because straightening felt like performing, and he was tired of performing. "Your Majesty," he said. She stopped a few steps away, close enough to speak quietly, far enough to give him space. "Your daughter," Harlan said, before she could speak. She was incredible. "Yes. Did you know she was going to do that?" A pause, very slight. "I suspected. But you didn't tell her to." "No." Harlan nodded. "She chose." "Yes," Seraphine said. "She chose." And the way she said it, the quiet pride beneath the composure, told Harlan everything he needed to know about what kind of mother Seraphine was. Not the kind who pushed, the kind who waited and trusted and created space for her child to find her own voice, even when waiting must have been unbearable. "The council will uphold the mark," Seraphine said, stating it as fact. Harlan exhaled. Good. However, of course there was a however. There was always a however. "I am going to do something that will surprise you," she said. Harlan blinked. More surprising than kissing me in front of 3-star systems worth of diplomats. The faintest shift in her expression, almost a smile. "Yes. I'm going to need a moment to prepare for that." "You will not have one." "Fair enough." Seraphine was quiet for a beat. Then two. The corridor around them hummed softly, the walls glowing, as if the building knew something was happening and had decided to lower its voice. "I gave you the mark," she said, "to protect you, in that moment, from Draven, from consequence, from a system that would have punished you for an act of compassion." "I understand." "I do not think you do." He waited. "The mark is protection," Seraphine continued, "but it is also a cage, a designation, a title that binds you to this world, to this house, to obligations you did not choose, and responsibilities you do not owe." She paused. "I will not hold you with chains, even chains made of honor." Harlan's breath caught, because he understood now what she was about to do. "When the council reconvenes," she said, "I will dissolve the mark." The words settled between them. "I will release you from the Ardol Sen, fully, completely, no obligation, no designation, no keeper, no title." Harlan stared at her. "You will be free," she said, "to leave, to return to Earth, to resume the life you had before you walked into that hall." "Why?" he asked, and the word came out rougher than he intended. Seraphine's gaze held his, steady, unwavering. "Because what you did in that hall," she said quietly, "was not the act of a keeper. It was not the act of a protector, or a diplomat, or a man seeking position." She paused. "It was the act of a father." The corridor went silent. Not the building's silence, not architecture designed to listen, just silence. The kind that lives between two people when one of them has seen something in the other that the other has been hiding from everyone, including themselves. Harlan's throat tightened. "And a father," Seraphine continued, her voice softer now, almost gentle, in a way that made the queen disappear and left only the woman. "Does not need a title to care, does not need permission to protect, does not need a mark to make his presence meaningful. She took a single step closer. I will not reduce what you did to a designation. I will not trap your compassion inside a ceremony. You deserve to choose, freely, without the weight of an obligation you never asked for. She paused, and when she spoke again, her voice carried something Harlan hadn't heard from her before. Not authority, not calculation. Something older than both of those. Something that had nothing to do with being a queen and everything to do with being someone who understood loss. I know what it is to watch your child and be unable to reach them, she said. I know what it costs to stand still when every part of you is screaming to move. She looked at him, and for the first time, the queen was gone, completely gone. What was left was a mother, standing in a corridor, talking to a father. You moved, she said, when I could not. And that one sentence, undid him. Harlan's vision blurred, just slightly. He blinked and looked away, toward the wall, which pulsed, gently. So, Seraphine said, when the council reconvenes, the mark will be dissolved, and you will stand in that room as nothing. No title, no protection, no designation. She paused. Just a man. Another pause. And then you will choose. Harlan looked back at her, eyes damp, jaw tight. Choose what? He asked, though he already knew. Seraphine's expression shifted. That same almost smile from the emergence hall, the one that contained more meaning than most people could fit into an entire conversation. Whether to stay, she said, or to go. The council reconvened. Harlan stood at the center of the room again. Same position, same faces, same cool, precise light, but different, because he was different. The presiding member announced the council's decision. The mark upheld. Draven's challenge denied. The room absorbed this with measured composure. And then Seraphine stood. I invoke the sovereign's prerogative, she said. Calm, clear. The room went very still. I dissolve the Ardol Sen, effective immediately. Silence, total, complete. Even Draven, whose entire challenge had just become unnecessary, looked stunned. The mark is dissolved, Seraphine continued. Harlan of Earth holds no title, no designation, no obligation to this world. He is free. She turned to look at him. Completely free. The council members exchanged glances. Confusion. Uncertainty. The presiding member leaned forward. Your Majesty, you fought to preserve the mark, and now you dissolve it yourself. Yes. May I ask why? Seraphine's gaze remained on Harlan. Because protection given is a gift, but freedom given is respect. The words landed in the room and scattered into something none of them had prepared for. Not argument, not strategy, just truth. The kind that doesn't need a building to verify it. Even Draven, for one brief, unguarded moment, had nothing to say. Harlan stood there, no title, no protection, no obligation. Just himself, a technician from Earth, standing in a room full of people who had spent 3 days deciding whether he belonged. And the answer, now, officially, was that he didn't. He was nobody again, free to leave, free to walk out of this room, down the corridor, through the docking bay, onto the transport, back to Earth, back to the apartment, back to the shoes by the door. Free, completely. The presiding member looked at him. The council session is concluded. You are released. Released. Harlan looked at the door, looked at the council, looked at Seraphine, whose gaze held his, saying nothing, asking nothing, simply waiting. Then he turned and walked out. The corridors felt different now, not because the building had changed, because he had. The walls still pulsed, the floor still responded, the architecture still hummed with its constant living awareness. But Harlan wasn't lost this time. He knew exactly where he was going. The docking bay. The transport was still there. Soren had kept it waiting. 4 days. Patient. Ready. A straight line back to Earth. Back to the life he'd built out of absence and distance. and the careful art of not being needed. He walked through the corridors, alone, his footsteps steady, the building tracking him the way it always did, his heart rate, his breathing, his emotional frequency, all of it broadcasting, all of it honest. He reached the docking bay and stopped. The transport sat at the berth, sleek, familiar, Earth-standard design. The hull markings he'd seen 100 times on 100 different assignments. The loading ramp extended, the interior lights on, engines in standby, waiting. Harlan stood at the threshold, not inside, not outside, at the line. He thought about Earth, the apartment, the hallway, the shoes. I thought about the way mornings felt there, how the light came through the kitchen window and hit the table where Nessa used to eat breakfast. How he'd sit at that table sometimes, not eating, just sitting, in the ghost of a routine that didn't exist anymore. He thought about the silence, not the Valorian kind, not the kind that was full of things waiting to be heard, the Earth kind, the kind that meant nothing was happening and nothing was going to happen. And that was the plan. I thought about 5 years of that plan, 5 years of arriving and leaving and never staying, 5 years of watching from the edge of rooms, holding tablets, calibrating systems, being the person who didn't matter. Because if you didn't matter, you couldn't lose anything. And if you couldn't lose anything, you were safe. Safe. He stared at the transport, and the transport stared back. I thought about the bench in the garden corridor, Leora sitting beside him, saying you're the most lost, with the casual certainty of someone stating a scientific fact. He thought about her father, the one she'd never met, the one she missed anyway, the idea of him. He thought about what it meant to be the idea of someone, to exist in a child's mind as a shape, a possibility, a space where a person should have been. Nessa had been real, not an idea, not a shape, a person, warm, loud, alive, and then not alive, and then a memory, and then something he couldn't look at directly because the brightness of it burned. But standing here, in this docking bay, with the hum of the transport engine vibrating through the floor, he realized something. She wasn't burning anymore. She was glowing, the way the columns in the emergence hall glowed, steady, warm, not consuming, just present. He could look at her now, in his mind, and not flinch. That was new. That was very new. Okay, Kay, he whispered. So this is the choice. Behind him, the corridor, the building, the planet that could feel his heartbeat, the queen who had given him a title and then taken it away. Not to punish him, but to set him free. And somewhere in that building, a child who kept finding him in corridors, who counted his wrong turns, who led him to dinner without saying a word, who stood in front of the most powerful people on her planet and said 12 sentences that changed everything. Because he had knelt down, because he had stayed, because for the first time in 5 years, he had chosen to be there. And now, standing at the edge of a docking bay, with a transport to Earth waiting, he had to choose again. Harlan closed his eyes, and behind his eyelids, for the last time, Nessa, 6 years old, brown eyes, that gap-toothed smile. She wasn't calling for him this time. She wasn't reaching. She wasn't lost. She was standing still, smiling, the way she used to smile when he came home from work, when she heard the door open, when she ran down the hallway in those small shoes that were still sitting by the door 5 years later, not asking him to come back, telling him it was okay, to go somewhere new, to be somewhere real, to stop living in the hallway of a life that ended and walk into the one that was waiting. Harlan opened his eyes. The transport hummed. He looked at it for a long time. Then he turned around and walked back the way he came. The corridors felt different this time, not confusing, not disorienting. The building seemed to know where he was going, even though he didn't. Not exactly. Doors opened before he reached them. Corridors straightened where they'd curved before. The light led him, gently, the way a hand on your shoulder leads you through a dark room. I wasn't sure if the building was helping or if he was finally paying attention. Either way, he didn't get lost, not once. And that, in itself, felt like an answer to a question he hadn't known he was asking. He walked faster, not running, but purposeful. The way you walk when you've made a decision and your body is catching up to your heart, and your heart is catching up to your mind, and everything is finally, moving in the same direction, towards something instead of away from it. He found Lyora in the garden corridor, not because he was looking for her, because she was looking for him, the way she always was, standing at the intersection of two hallways, waiting, patient, as if she had known exactly which direction he'd come from and exactly how long it would take. She looked at him. He looked at her. "You didn't leave," she said, not surprised, not relieved, just stating a fact, the way children do, without the layers of performance that adults wrap around everything. "No," Harlan said. "The transport is still in the bay." "I know. It's going to leave soon." "I know that too." She studied him, those clear, steady eyes, the same ones that had been wide with panic 4 days ago, now calm, anchored in something that hadn't been there before. "Are you lost again?" Again, she asked, quiet, almost teasing. Harlan smiled. A real one, not big, not performative. The kind of smile that starts somewhere deep and arrives at the mouth last. "Yeah," he said, "pretty lost." "I can show you the way." He nodded, once. "Yeah," he said, softly. "I think I'd like that." Lyora turned and walked, and Harlan followed. Through corridors that curved and glowed. Through spaces where the architecture opened into something wilder, more organic. Through the living heart of a building that had been watching him since the moment he arrived. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. The building adjusted around them. Corridors opening, light softening, walls humming with a frequency that required no translation. That meant the same thing in every language, in every system, on every world. Safety, belonging, home. They reached the observation deck, the one Leora had shown him 2 days ago, the one with the wide transparent ceiling and the view of the Valorian sky, the one where they'd sat in silence, where she'd told him about her father, where he'd laughed for the first time in 5 years. It looked different now, not physically, the same transparent ceiling, the same view, the same quiet, but it felt different. The way a room feels different when you know you're not leaving it. They sat down, side by side, the way they had the first time, their shoulders not quite touching, the distance between them the exact width of a child's trust. Above them, stars, purple sky, deep, vast, scattered with points of light that were, Harlan had to admit, very quiet. The kind of stars that didn't expect anything from you. He sat there, breathing, in, out, steady now, not shaky, not uneven, just breathing. And behind them, very far away now, almost inaudible. The transport powered its engines, waited, and then, without its passenger, departed. Harlan heard it go. Oh, the faint vibration through the floor, the building registering the departure, a subtle shift in the ambient hum. He didn't turn around. He didn't need to. Lyora glanced at him. Just once. Quick. Checking. He was still there. She looked back at the stars. Minutes passed. Or hours. Time worked differently here. He'd said that once, as a joke. But now he understood it was true. Not in the way the building measured cycles and frequencies, but in the way that mattered. Time moved at the speed of the person you were with. And right now, with this child, on this deck, under these stars, time was patient. A sound. Behind them. Footsteps so soft the building barely registered them. Seraphine. She didn't announce herself. She didn't need to. Harlan felt her the way everyone felt her. The slight shift in gravity, the room reorganizing around a presence it recognized as fundamental. She stood at the entrance of the observation deck, and she watched, not with the precision of a queen, not with the calculation of a ruler, with the quiet attention of a mother, seeing her daughter, at peace, beside someone who had earned that trust not through title or designation or ancient ceremony, but by kneeling down. Seraphine stepped forward, slowly, stopped beside them, her gaze directed toward the sky. She did not sit. Queens, Harlan suspected, did not sit on observation deck floors. Probably. He wasn't sure of the protocol. He was never sure of the protocol. But she stayed. And that, Harlan was beginning to understand, was how Seraphine said the things she couldn't say out loud. Not with words, not with gestures, not with ancient marks and ceremonial kisses and sovereign prerogatives. With presence. She stayed because staying was the sentence she couldn't speak. The building knew it. The rings on her ears pulsed faintly, catching the ambient frequency, processing it, and finding, for the first time in what Harlan suspected was a very long time, that the emotional resonance in this room was not complicated. It was simple. Three people, under stars, choosing to be here. That was all. And the three of them, in the quiet, under the stars, on a planet where buildings could feel heartbeats and floors had opinions and walls remembered everything, were still. Not the Valorian kind of stillness, not the kind that meant absence, not the kind that Draven valued, not the kind that protocol demanded. A different kind. The kind that happens when people stop performing, stop positioning, stop calculating, and simply are. Lyora's voice, small, quiet. Will he stay? Not directed at Harlan, at her mother. Seraphine was quiet for a moment. Then she looked down at her daughter, and then at Harlan. And there was something in her gaze now that hadn't been there in the emergence hall, or the corridor, or the tribunal. Something beyond observation, beyond assessment, beyond the careful, measured intelligence that made her the queen she was. Recognition, not of what he could do, or what he represented, or what political advantage his presence might offer, but of who he was. He already has, Seraphine said. Harlan looked up at her. She did not smile. But the way the light caught the rings along her ears, the way the hall's resonance shifted, just slightly, into something warmer, told him everything her expression did not. He nodded. Once. Yeah, he said quietly. I have. Lyora leaned back, looking at the sky, her small shoulders relaxed, her hands resting, open. Harlan leaned back too. The building hummed around them. The stars burned overhead. Quiet, patient, the kind that didn't expect anything. And Harlan, for the first time in 5 years, didn't expect anything either. He was just there, present, not because a title demanded it, not because an obligation held him, not because running had finally exhausted him, though it had, because he chose it, because a child had grabbed his sleeve, and he had stayed, and staying had changed everything. Not the politics, not the protocol, not the centuries of tradition that govern this world. Him. It had changed him. All right, he said, mostly to himself, under his breath, looking at the stars. New plan. He paused, then, with a faint smile that started in his chest and arrived at his mouth last. No plan. Leora heard him and smiled. Seraphine heard him and turned her gaze back to the sky and the building, which heard everything, which felt everything, which had been watching since the moment he walked through its doors, pulsed once, softly, warmly, and then went still. The good kind of still, the kind that means everything is exactly where it's supposed